further makes it likely that we're going to move our musculature more. But get this, adrenaline, epinephrine doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. So how does it increase our level of alertness in our brain, right? You don't want your body to be super active and your brain to be kind of sleepy. That's not good. That's not adaptive. Turns out that when the adrenals release adrenaline, it binds to receptors on the vagus nerve itself, those sensory axons that extend into the body. There are receptors on those wires, right? Not all the receptors are at one end or the other. They're also on those axons. The adrenaline binds to the receptors on those axons, and the vagus nerve, in turn, releases glutamate, an excitatory neurotransmitter, in a structure in the brain called the nucleus tractus solitarius. The neurons in what I'm just going to call the NTS for simplicity, in turn, activate neurons in a brain structure called the locus coeruleus. The locus coeruleus contains neurons that release what's called norepinephrine. And the neurons of locus coeruleus send their axons out very extensively across the brain in kind of a sprinkler system-like organization, such that when you move the large musculature of your body, you release adrenaline. That adrenaline activates the tissues of your body, makes them more likely to move, also binds to receptors on the vagus. The vagus nerve in turn releases glutamate, an excitatory neurotransmitter in the NTS. The NTS then passes off that excitatory signal like a bucket brigade off to the locus coeruleus. The locus coeruleus dumps a bunch of norepinephrine into the brain and increases your levels of alertness. What this means is that the vagus nerve is central to the process of using physical activity to make your brain more alert. And we know that activation of locus coeruleus makes the brain areas that are involved in motivation and the propensity to move more higher in levels of activity. In other words, if you're not feeling motivated to exercise or you're not feeling alert enough, movement of the body that includes especially the legs, the large muscles of the legs, so quadriceps, hamstrings, etc., as well as the trunk muscles of the body, stimulate this pathway in a kind of dominoing effect that makes the likelihood and, believe it or not, the desire to move much more likely. This I've personally found to be an immensely useful piece of information because sure, I knew that sometimes I would go to the gym or I'd head out on a run and I wasn't feeling motivated, or I'd sit down to do some work and I'd feel kind of sleepy despite the fact that I'd slept pretty well the night before and eaten just fine and the room wasn't too warm, etc. I feel kind of lethargic. And I was like, what's going on here? And yes, I had the experience of sometimes, doing a bit of a warm up, maybe some light calisthenics, maybe a few warm up sets or jogging for a little while and then finding that my levels of alertness increased. But I've also had just as often the experience of not feeling that motivation for physical activity or for cognitive activity come online, especially if I wasn't extremely interested in that activity or that thing that I was supposed to learn. It's very easy to be excited when we want to do the activity or we want to learn the thing that we're supposed to be learning at a given moment or reading at a given moment. This pathway is immensely useful to understand because it explains why it is that even when you're not feeling motivated, if you do some activity that, yes, is preceded by a bit of a warm-up. So maybe, you do some light calisthenics or you go on the treadmill for a few minutes, walking, then maybe a little bit faster, that it can increase your levels of alertness and motivation. But it especially explains how if you put in some effort that at the moment feels like a big exertion, your entire body and brain state shifts in a way that levels of motivation and energy to do more physical work or more cognitive work or both increases dramatically. And these are not small effects when they've been measured. In fact, for all the talk that's out there in kind of pop psychology and in kind of pop neuroscience about the vagus being a calming pathway, all the neurophysiologists out there, and I know there aren't very many, but I'm friends with a lot of neurophysiologists, they'll all tell you that if they're doing a surgery or they're doing some sort of brain recording and the animal or person that they're doing the brain recording from is starting to drop into a state of kind of deep parasympathetic activity, they're falling asleep or they need to be more alert, what do? They stimulate the vagus. They stimulate the vagus nerve in order to wake up the brain. In fact, stimulating the vagus has been used to save people's lives when they are drifting too far down into deeper and deeper planes of anesthesia. So stimulating the vagus wakes up the brain. And the way to stimulate the vagus is by way of these receptors on the vagus nerve itself. And the way to do that without an electrical stimulator, right, because we're not talking about clinical conditions here, in order to increase levels of motivation, alertness, and focus for physical activity or cognitive activity and learning, etc., or simply to overcome lethargy and brain fog, is to do some sort of physical activity that includes the large musculature of your body. These could be things like jumping. These could be things like actual resistance training. This could be running. This information really points to the idea of course, after a good warm-up, doing more sprinting type activity, more strength type activity, 6 repetitions or less where you're getting close to failure, this sort of thing, to wake up the brain and body, as opposed to doing long rhythmic activity that's below the threshold of what would activate a lot of adrenaline from the adrenals. So the idea is to get those adrenals to release adrenaline into your system. It won't cross the blood-brain barrier, but your vagus nerve provides this beautiful link between the body and brain to match levels of excitation from the body to the brain, and you can leverage that. In addition, there's also the well-described effects, and I've done an entire episode about this, of how exercise can improve brain plasticity and the ability to learn. And while there are a host of mechanisms involving long-term changes in things like brain-derived neurotrophic factor and increases in lactate, which might open the door to plasticity and so on and so forth, it does seem that one of the major ways that exercise improves our brain function and our ability to learn is simply by increasing our levels of alertness. And I should say the word simply placed in there is probably a bit unfair. There is absolutely nothing trivial about using exercise as a way to stimulate a sort of cascade of this neural circuit from the adrenals up the vagus and into locus coeruleus in order to wake up your brain networks that are involved in motivation, focus, and learning. As we'll talk about in a few minutes, many of us, most of us perhaps, are used to using pharmacology like caffeine or other stimulants in order to try and wake up levels of alertness in the brain. And I'm not being disparaging of that. I am an avid consumer of caffeine in the form of yerba mate or coffee. I'll occasionally take an alpha GPC or an L-tyrosine as well. I do all those things. However, in my opinion, it's far more powerful to be able to leverage, that is, to activate these levels of alertness in your brain and body in a way that doesn't require any pharmacology. If you don't have it available to you, or you're trying to avoid pharmacology, or you're working out late at night, or you want to focus later at night, you don't want to be kept awake by the caffeine, or even if you consume caffeine or other stimulants, knowing the organization of these neural circuits from the body to the brain and how they match levels of alertness and leveraging them is so straightforward, but most people don't actually get to the point where they're doing that high intensity work or they're doing the work that involves the large musculature of their body when they're feeling not motivated. In fact, they usually do the opposite thing. Now, sometimes you need rest days. This is true, right? You need to rest and recover to make progress. You don't want to exhaust yourself. You need to get sleep. You need to take care of yourself. However, the reason we're talking about this is it's a beautiful opportunity to A, explain that the vagus nerve is not just about calming down. It's actually actively used to wake up your brain when your body is active, when the large musculature of your body is active. And B, that like with autoregulation, this stuff is under conscious control. Yes, if you were to be frightened immediately, this is the same pathway that would be reflexively activated by an intruder or by, a big explosion or something of that sort. Your body would wake up, release adrenaline, then that adrenaline would set up along this cascade and your mind would be immediately alert as well. There's some parallel mechanisms too to make sure that your brain and your body are alert immediately. But when you start to understand what these pathways are and that they're very specific and very powerful, potent inroads into activating these circuits, it does indeed give you a tremendous amount of agency. Especially for those of you that might think you're not motivated to exercise or you're always lethargic or you have brain fog. There might be other reasons for that, but for many people, chances are you're not getting past that threshold whereby these circuits involving the vagus can be activated. And now you know how. So activate them. I'd like to take a quick break and acknowledge one of our sponsors, Function. Last year, I became a Function member after searching for the most comprehensive approach to lab testing. Function provides over 100 advanced lab tests that give you a key snapshot of your entire bodily health. This snapshot offers you with insights on your heart health, hormone health, immune functioning, nutrient levels, and much more. They've also recently added tests for toxins such as BPA exposure from harmful plastics and tests for PFASs or forever chemicals. Function not only provides testing of over 100 biomarkers key to your physical and mental health, but it also analyzes these results and provides insights from top doctors who are expert in the relevant areas. For example, in one of my first tests with Function, I learned that I had elevated levels of mercury in my blood. Function not only helped me detect that, but offered insights into how best to reduce my mercury levels, which included limiting my tuna consumption, I'd been eating a lot of tuna, while also making an effort to eat more leafy greens and supplementing with NAC and acetylcysteine, both of which can support glutathione production and detoxification. And I should say, by taking a second function test, that approach worked. Comprehensive blood testing is vitally important. There's so many things related to your mental and physical health that can only be detected in a blood test. The problem is blood testing has always been very expensive and complicated. In contrast, I've been super impressed by Function's simplicity and at the level of cost. It is very affordable. As a consequence, I decided to join their scientific advisory board, and I'm thrilled that they're sponsoring the podcast. If you'd like to try Function, you can go to functionhealth.com/Huberman. Function currently has a wait list of over 250,000 people, but they're offering early access to Huberman podcast listeners. Again, that's functionhealth.com/Huberman to get early access to Function. I just got done telling you how you can increase your levels of alertness by activating this vagal nerve pathway from the body to the brain, and that increasing your level of alertness allows for more opportunity to focus and to learn. But when we say focus and learn, what we're really talking about is neuroplasticity, this incredible feature of your nervous system to be able to change in response to experience in deliberate ways. The plasticity that you have when you are a child, from the time you're born until about age 25, typically can occur even in passive experience. That is, you're in class, a teacher's teaching you something, your brain is changing. Maybe you put a bit more effort into something, you're focused, your brain will change. But as we get into adulthood, most of our neural maps in the brain, certainly our sensory maps and our cortex, our motor maps that allow us to move in particular ways, those have been established. You can still change them, but they've mostly been established throughout childhood and into our early 20s. And if we want to modify those circuits with neuroplasticity, there are a couple of key requirements. One, you need to be alert. You can't get neuroplasticity. That is, you can't trigger neuroplasticity unless you're alert. You also have to be focused. This is critical and differentiates adult plasticity in a major way from plasticity when we're young, where we can learn by passive exposure. Okay? When we're young, we can learn by passive exposure, or even better, by focused exposure. But when we are adults, we need alertness and we need focus. Just passively being exposed to, music or to a motor pattern is not going to allow us to change our nervous system. That's been shown over and over again. Fortunately, what also has been shown over and over again is that if we are alert and we're focused and we are determined, especially if we undertake what's called incremental learning, where we go after small bits of neuroplasticity repeatedly over time, we can get as much neuroplasticity as one observes in childhood. It just takes longer, and you have to do it so-called incrementally. There's a lot to say about that, but for sake of today's discussion about the vagus nerve, I just want to tell you that there's a particular pathway in the brain that involves the molecule acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is used to contract the muscles. It's released from motor neurons in the spinal cord onto muscles to contract the muscles. It's also used in the brain and elsewhere in the nervous system, and it does a lot of different things. It's actually involved in generating the rhythms of the heart. But acetylcholine released from a particular nucleus in the brain called nucleus basalis. The acetylcholine released from nucleus basalis is what we call permissive for plasticity. In other words, if you have acetylcholine released from nucleus basalis into the brain, plasticity is much more likely to occur. And in fact, acetylcholine released from nucleus basalis is sort of like a gate whereby if you release acetylcholine, the opportunity for neuroplasticity and learning is available for some period of time. So the question, therefore, becomes, how do you get acetylcholine released from nucleus basalis? There are these incredible experiments that have been done by Mike Merzenich and colleagues showing that if you stimulate nucleus basalis to release acetylcholine and you expose an animal or a human to a particular sensory stimulus, the brain remaps very fast according to that experience. Just enormous amounts of plasticity that you wouldn't observe otherwise. There are also, fortunately, experiments showing that if you pharmacologically increase acetylcholine, that you can enhance the opportunity for neuroplasticity. You still need to do the learning. You still need to attempt to learn something. You still have to make it incremental, but the amount of plasticity is significantly increased when there's acetylcholine released from nucleus basalis. So in the absence of deep brain stimulation using an electrode, which most of you fortunately will not experience because it requires drilling down through the skull and placing an electrode in basalis, and assuming that you're not taking anything to increase acetylcholine transmission to learn, although there are ways to do that. I've talked about that before, and I'll talk about that again in a future podcast. Some of those ways include supplementing with things like alpha-GPC, which is a precursor to acetylcholine. There are some other precursors to acetylcholine or things that stimulate the release of acetylcholine, such as huperzine and things like that, that will open the opportunity for enhanced plasticity for a few hours. And there is good old nicotine. I know the word nicotine brings to mind things like lung cancer because for many, many years, many people, and still now, smoked nicotine in the form of cigarettes or vaping, both of which I think are absolutely terrible, as is dipping and snuffing, because yes, they increase levels of nicotinic acetylcholine receptor activation, which is just fancy nerd speak for acetylcholine transmission in the brain is enhanced by nicotine. But those delivery mechanisms also, of course, can give you cancer in the case of smoking, dipping, or snuffing. And vaping, despite what you hear out there, is absolutely terrible for your health. I don't care what anybody says. The evidence is starting to really pile up that vaping is bad for you. Now, is oral form nicotine bad for you in the form of gum or in the form of a pouch, etc.? I just want to say a couple of things. One, it's extremely habit forming. Two, it increases blood pressure and it's a vasoconstrictor. These drawbacks about nicotine are real and are critical to consider if you're going to use nicotine as a focusing agent or a so-called nootropic. I don't really like that word, but if you're using nicotine as a way to enhance cognition and enhance neuroplasticity, you should know what the potential drawbacks are, most notably the habit forming and addicting properties, which are very robust. Now, with that said, there are ways to non-pharmacologically stimulate the nucleus basalis acetylcholine pathway to enhance the window for plasticity. And the way to do that is, you guessed it, through the vagus nerve. Studies in healthy humans and humans who have had, for instance, stroke, as well as animal studies have shown that if you stimulate the vagus nerve electrically, you increase the level of alertness in the brain, and part of the mechanism by which you do that is the one I told you about a few minutes ago, the adrenals, vagus, locus coeruleus, but also there's a separate pathway from the NTS to nucleus basalis that stimulates the release of acetylcholine from nucleus basalis and opens up the opportunity for neuroplasticity. This, I should mention, is not a small effect. It is a rapid effect, and it's one that has allowed stroke patients, for instance, to improve their motor capabilities very quickly as compared to when the vagus nerve is not stimulated or when acetylcholine transmission is not enhanced pharmacologically. And fortunately now, there are studies starting to accumulate in animal models and some in humans. We need more, but there are some showing that if you enhance alertness by way of activating the vagus nerve, through the mechanism that I told you before, which is good old-fashioned high-intensity exercise, that in the several hours following that exercise, there is an enhanced opportunity for neuroplasticity. Now, that enhanced opportunity for neuroplasticity comes by way of two different pathways. You already heard about the first one, which is the locus coeruleus release of norepinephrine. That's going to increase alertness, which is a prerequisite for focus. And it appears to be the case that the release of acetylcholine from nucleus basalis that's also triggered by this high-intensity exercise is what allows for that alertness to be converted into focus. And those two things together, alertness and focus, are the triggers for adult neuroplasticity. If you think about this, this is really exciting. For 25 years or more, we've known that plasticity is possible in the adult human. We knew you needed alertness and you needed focus. We also, by the way, know that you need to get great sleep that night and in subsequent nights in order to actually allow the plasticity to occur. Plasticity is a process. It's not just triggered when you go about trying to learn something. It actually takes place in sleep, as well as sleep-like states like non-sleep deep rest and meditation, but especially in deep sleep and rapid eye movement sleep. This is why you can attempt to learn something cognitively or behaviorally over and over and over. You can't get those scales on the piano right. You can't get the information dialed in from your class, a language class, or from engineering, or you're trying to figure out what this picture should be in your mind that you're going to paint, etc. You work at it, you work at it, you work at it, you sleep, and then one day you wake up and suddenly you have the skill. It's because the actual rewiring of those circuits that we call neuroplasticity occurs during sleep, but it's triggered in those moments of incremental learning and really struggling. And keep in mind, the struggle to learn something, that friction is part of the neuroplasticity process. And it's oh so clear now that alertness and focus are the prerequisites for plasticity, that alertness is coming in large part by way of the release of norepinephrine from locus coeruleus, that the focus is being augmented And perhaps it's even originating entirely from the release of acetylcholine in nucleus basalis that acts as sort of a spotlight on a particular set of things that are happening while we're trying to learn. And then that triggers the plasticity process, which takes place during sleep. So that beautiful picture of self-directed adaptive plasticity in adulthood is allowed to happen because the vagus nerve, in part, is triggering NTS to say, hey, locus ceruleus, nucleus basalis, wake up, release norepinephrine, release acetylcholine. Now's the time to learn. So what this means is, if you're struggling to learn, if you want to continue to have robust neuroplasticity, if you happen to have some damage to motor pathways, or you're having trouble with focusing and brain fog, keep in mind, focus itself is served by a circuit that is subject to plasticity. You can actually get better at focusing by working on focus just the same way you would on any skill. And so if you're struggling with focus, I highly recommend finding a threshold of exercise that stimulates brain alertness, that triggers these pathways that are now starting to be clear that they occur from the literature in animals and humans. And yes, you might augment this with something like caffeine, which will further increase levels of norepinephrine. You might even use low-dose nicotine. I'm not necessarily recommending that, certainly not for young people. And you do need to be aware of the habit-forming, aka addictive properties of nicotine. You definitely don't want to consume it in any form that's going to cause you to increase your risk of cancer or popcorn lung from vaping. You could use pharmacology. You could use alpha-GPC. You could use huperzine in combination with exercise. However, I strongly, strongly recommend that anyone who's interested in lifelong learning, think about organizing your bouts of learning, especially cognitive learning, to come in the 2 to 3 hours, maybe even 4 hours, but certainly in the 1 to 2 hours after you do some sort of exercise that doesn't leave you exhausted, but leaves you with elevated levels of energy in your body. So you don't want to take this physical exercise that I'm talking about to exhaustion, because that's going to leave you depleted. That's going to cause a, uptick in parasympathetic activity. Any of you that have done a hard leg workout and then, 2-3 hours later, you're just like, it's very clear brain oxygen levels are down, parasympathetic activity is up. You are tired because you exhausted all that energy in exercise. But if you can use exercise as a trigger to release adrenaline and stimulate these pathways within the brain that arrive via the signaling from the vagus, you do indeed open up the opportunity for enhanced neuroplasticity at any age. And that is a non-trivial thing. In fact, it's downright exciting because the search for adult neuroplasticity tools is one that's existed probably for thousands of years and that has been documented for hundreds of years. And the thing that makes the nervous system of humans so special is that it is capable of changing itself throughout the lifespan. So now you know at least one method by which you can do that, and it, of course, involves the vagus. Okay, so one of the most incredible things about the vagus nerve that I myself have really not ever heard talked about out there is the way it communicates and coordinates levels of serotonin in the gut with levels of serotonin in the brain. Now, a discussion about serotonin that's complete would take many, many hours, but suffice to say that serotonin is a neuromodulator, much like dopamine or acetylcholine or norepinephrine, in that it modulates the activity of other circuits. It's critically important for mood. In the gut, it's critically important for gut motility, for ease of digestion, and for gut health. In the brain, we say serotonin is important for mood. I don't want to give the impression that high levels of serotonin good, low levels of serotonin bad. Serotonin needs to be at a particular level, so neither too high nor too low. As many of you know, one of the major ways that depression has been treated over the last decades is through the administration of something called SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which have the net effect of increasing levels of serotonin at synapses. SSRIs are somewhat controversial because in many people, they do alleviate certain symptoms of depression, but they often carry side effects because serotonin is used in multiple circuits throughout the brain. I don't want to give the impression that SSRIs are always bad or always good. It's highly dependent on the patient and a bunch of other things that really, unfortunately, can only be explored through experimentation. That's typically what psychiatrists will do. They'll prescribe an SSRI at a given dose, see how a patient reacts. Maybe they'll take them off an SSRI entirely, give them a different type of antidepressant that works on a different set of neuromodulators like dopamine and norepinephrine. So Wellbutrin would be a non-SSRI antidepressant. And there are a whole set of issues around SSRIs. For instance, they can be very beneficial for people with full clinical OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And then again, other people suffer terrible side effects from SSRIs. So I don't want to suggest that SSRIs are a solution. I also don't want to suggest that serotonin is the only problem with depression or is always a problem in cases of depression. That itself is heavily debated. What's emerging from the data is that elevating levels of serotonin in the brain can increase neuroplasticity, which can allow people who have major depression to learn new contingencies. These are people who at one point are thinking, why would I ever try and get a new relationship or job? Like, everything always turns out terribly. These are hallmarks of depression, lack of excitement about the future. Everything's a negative outcome in their mind. Through neuroplasticity, it's clear that people can form new contingencies. They can start to imagine life as more positive and holding more possibility. And changing levels of serotonin is known to be, much in the same way acetylcholine can increase plasticity, permissive for neuroplasticity. So that might be one way by which SSRIs actually can provide help for certain people for depression. However, because of the side effects associated with SSRIs, many people are leaning away from them. And yet, having adequate levels of serotonin is absolutely critical for people depressed, as well as people who are not depressed, to feel a sense of well-being, just overall sense of well-being, being okay with who they are and where life is at, being able to lean into effort and all these things. It's absolutely critical that we have adequate levels of serotonin in the brain. Now, you may have heard, and it is absolutely true, that 90% of the serotonin manufactured in your body is in the gut. Now, what you don't often hear is that serotonin stays in the gut, right? We hear these days, most of your serotonin is manufactured in your gut, which has given millions of people the false impression that if you get your gut serotonin right, somehow it's traveling up to your brain and performing all the important roles that serotonin plays in your brain. That's not how it works at all. Fortunately, however, there are ways that you can modify the levels of serotonin in your gut. And indeed, the levels of serotonin in your gut powerfully impact the levels of serotonin in your brain. And this occurs, you guessed it, by way of the vagus. It's a super cool mechanism, and it's one that you can exert some positive control over in order to, for instance, increase your baseline levels of mood, in order to increase levels of serotonin if that's something that you seek. Here's the pathway and the mechanism, and I'm going to provide this in kind of top contour form. In the future, I'll do an entire episode about serotonin, but here's the idea. In your gut, you have cells, including neurons, but you also have a lot of other cells, mostly other cells, frankly. And there's a particular category of cells called the enterochromaffin cells. You don't need to know that name, but if you want, they're the enterochromaffin cells, and they manufacture serotonin. They do that through a beautiful pathway involving an enzymatic reaction that converts tryptophan from the food you eat. Tryptophan's an amino acid, gets converted eventually into serotonin. There are a bunch of steps in there in the biochemistry. Gets converted into serotonin. That serotonin binds to the ends of neurons, the axons of neurons in the vagus nerve that innervate your gut, not just your stomach, but your large intestine and your small intestine. Remember, those sensory afferents, those sensory axons that extend into the body have receptors on them, right? The serotonin in the gut, assuming you're getting enough tryptophan, and assuming the milieu of your gut is correct, we'll talk about what that means and how you can exert control over it, get the milieu right. That serotonin binds to the ends of those axons in the gut and stimulates a particular category of them that then relays the signal up and through nodose ganglion, you now are familiar with these names, up into the brain to the nucleus tractus solitarius, okay, that NTS again. And then the nucleus tractus solitarius doesn't just communicate with locus coeruleus and with nucleus basalis, it also sends a powerful signal to what's called the dorsal raphe nucleus. The dorsal raphe nucleus in your brain is responsible for the release of the majority of the serotonin in your brain. So when you hear that most of the serotonin in your body is made in your gut, that's true, and it stays in your gut. But the levels of serotonin are communicated to the brain by the vagus and then stimulates the release of serotonin from the dorsal raphe nucleus. So the question, therefore, becomes, if we want to increase levels of serotonin in the brain, or simply to maintain healthy levels of serotonin in the brain for somebody who's not depressed, or maybe somebody who's having low mood, or just to keep elevated levels of mood and proper levels of serotonin overall, because it's involved in lots of things, not just mood, we need to make sure that we're getting adequate production of serotonin in the gut. And again, adequate production of serotonin in the gut has a bunch of other positive effects on the immune system, on gut motility. In fact, having adequate levels of serotonin in the gut is powerfully associated with having a healthy gut and not having irritable gut. Irritable bowel syndrome is something that vexes many people. You know, it might sound kind of funny to those of you that don't have, oh, you have an irritable bowel. People with IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, oftentimes suffer tremendously. They can't go out to dinner. They can't eat foods that other people offer them. They'll eat a bunch of foods for a while and feel fine. Then they feel terrible. It's not just about having diarrhea. Often they have a bunch of other gut issues, and it's correlated with a bunch of other major problems over time. We're going to do an entire episode about gut health as it relates to IBS. There are things that you can do to improve IBS. One of them is to keep your or get your gut levels of serotonin right. How do you do that? Well, one way to do that is to make sure that the microbiota of your gut are healthy and that they are diverse. The best way to do that, not using any kind of supplementation, is to make sure that you're ingesting 1 to 4 servings of low sugar fermented foods per day. I've talked about this before on the podcast. This is based on beautiful data from my colleague Justin Sonnenberg and Christopher Gardner at Stanford, showed that the ingestion of 1 to 4 servings of low sugar fermented foods per day, so these would be things like kimchi, sauerkraut, again, low sugar, look at the labels. This is the stuff that would need to be refrigerated. We're not talking about pickles kept on the non-refrigerated shelf in the non-refrigerated section of the grocery store, but rather the brine and the pickles that don't have a ton of sugar. So the sour pickles, that is, that are kept in the refrigerator, things like kimchi, things like kombucha. Keep in mind, some kombucha has alcohol, so keep that in mind if you're giving this to kids who shouldn't be ingesting alcohol. Many adults probably shouldn't be ingesting alcohol. Kombucha has very little alcohol, but if you're an alcoholic and you're completely avoiding alcohol, you should know that. Kombucha contains some alcohol. Things like kefir, quality yogurts, low sugar yogurts. You can look up online what are different low sugar fermented foods. These things are going to improve the gut microbiota that in turn promote the production of serotonin if and only if, this is important, if and only if there's also sufficient levels of tryptophan in your dietary intake. So you're going to want to take a look at what you're eating, and just through a simple online search, you can figure out whether or not you're getting sufficient levels of tryptophan. Many people are familiar with the idea, because it's true, that turkey contains high levels of tryptophan. This is thought to be responsible for the post-Thanksgiving dinner effect, although that's probably due to just eating a lot of food. And when the gut is distended, the distension of the gut is communicated by mechanosensors up the vagus nerve, sensory neurons, and set in motion the so-called rest and digest, or I guess it would be like collapse and pass out. In the case of Thanksgiving, collapse and pass out effect of having a lot of food in your gut. Doesn't matter what the food is, but you're going to want to make sure that you're ingesting foods with sufficient levels of tryptophan. So dairy products will do that. White turkey meat will do that. There are other foods that have tryptophan in them. I'm not going to bother to list those off now. You can simply look those up. So make sure you're getting enough tryptophan in your diet